Everybody, we'll be starting at the top of the hour, so please be patient. Welcome everybody to the Plexus AIAG Golden Rules to Enhancing Your FEMA Process. 7 things to take your FEMA development process from good to great. So it's a privilege to have everybody here today. We're going to touch on a few housekeeping things before we move into this and make sure everybody's up to speed on everything. First off, if you're having technical problems, audio or you're not able to see the presentation or any technical problem like that, your best bet is to log off and then try to log back in. And the other good news is if you're unable to connect, which I question if you'll have that many challenges, but if you do, keep in mind that this is recorded and it will be provided at the end of the webinar. So, regardless, you're going to get the opportunity to participate in the webinar. And I apologize if you have IT problems. Next up is Q&A, guys. At the bottom of your screen, right down here at the very bottom, you'll see something called Q&A. If you have a question, please put it into the Q&A. Okay, at the end of the webinar, we'll take about 15 minutes and answer some of the questions. I'll tell you now, we won't get to them all, but what we do is we pull that list at the end of the webinar, and then we get with our team and we respond to everybody that sent a question in. Okay, next up is chat. You can chat with me directly. If you have a challenge, you can chat with me and I'll see what I can do to help you out. But chat at the end of the webinar, guys, questions are not pulled from chat. They're pulled from Q&A. So let's make sure we put our questions in Q&A. Last but not least, I'll say one more time, everybody will have the opportunity to get a copy of the recording of this webinar upon completion. Okay, I see that already clicking in there. So with that, let me introduce the 2 people that will be participating today. So I'm going to start on the right with Brian Martinson. Brian is the senior, or my right, might be your left, I hope not. No, senior program manager for quality products and services at the AIG. Brian's had an excellent career, went to GMI, 25 years in industry, and then transitioned over to the AIG, and he has 5 years with the AIG and does a lot of these webinars with us. He's a great resource, and if you haven't had a chance, you should take a look at the Core Tool self-assessment that's online to help evaluate you. Brian does amazing things with the data. I'm stunned with some of the things I see, and it's an excellent guide to assist you in understanding where your organization's strengths and weaknesses are. So on the other side, we have Jeremy Hazel, lead consultant, trainer, content development at Plexus International. Jeremy's been in industry for over 20 years. He has written numerous books, 9001 on AS 9100, 13485, and IATF. Brian is one of our lead trainers and is extremely knowledgeable. So it's my pleasure to present to you probably two of the most knowledgeable people that I associate with. So with that, gentlemen, it's yours. Go for it.
All right, folks. So welcome to the webinar. So what I'd like to do to begin with here today, I'd like to go ahead and I'd like to start off by going through and setting what we are going to cover, what we're not going to cover, so that the expectations are very clear. So the agenda looks a little bit like this. The first thing we're going to do here is we're going to take you into the FMEA life cycle. Now, what this webinar is for those that already have an awareness of FMEA. So we assume that you know about the AIAG, VDA, FMEA, and this webinar is largely for tips and tricks on how to weaponize it. So as Bill mentioned, I've been going through for the last 2.5 years with this new method, and I've been doing FMEA for about 20. And so when we thought about how to add value, one of the things that came up was everybody has a certain amount of awareness at this point. There are webinars out there on that. But the number one thing I get when going out into the field is how to make this beneficial. We know what it is. We just don't know routinely how to utilize it. So with this webinar, we're going to start by looking at the life cycle of the FMEA, and we're going to break it down into real actionable steps and techniques that I use when facilitating in terms of the initiation of the FMEA, the development of the FMEA. And once your FMEA is launched, we're going to talk about the maturity of the FMEA. And lastly, when your FMEA has been out there for a while and it's ending the end of its life cycle, we're going to talk about some tips that you can do and some best practices in terms of how to leverage your FMEA. So if you're hoping to know what the AP calculation was in the AIAG VDA FMEA, that was a lot of acronym, we're not going to do that. We're going to show you how to make it applicable so that once you have the awareness, how do you weaponize it to get the most bang for your buck? So that being said, I'd like to turn it over to Brian, and Brian's going to walk you through here after a poll. Now, the poll, let's go ahead and get interactive with you guys for a second. What I'm about to do is I'm going to put the poll up on your screen. Now, hear me very clearly. There are going to be 3 questions to this poll. And why are we asking you to participate right from the jump? 1, we want you to be interactive with this webinar. While you could passively consume this, it is not optimal in terms of your learning. The second thing that we're going to talk about is we want to understand who is in the room with us, because based on the results of this poll, it will change how Brian and I present from here on out. So let's go ahead and launch this. So the first big question: what is your current FMEA situation in your organization? By the way, folks, this is single answer, multiple choice. Only check 1. The second, how many dedicated facilitators or moderators do you have? And the third of 3 is select how many years of experience you have in FMEA on your own, not necessarily in your organization. So your organization might be 100 years old and you might have gotten involved with FMEA just 2 years ago. So I have a rule. I stop the fun when we get about 80% participation. So if you want the activity to wrap up, participate. Simple. Right, rolling in here. We're sitting at about 50%. Let's keep those numbers rolling. And by the way, this energy continues all the way through the full hour. All right, almost there, folks. Wrapping it up. Little over 70%. We end at 80%. I am not naive enough to think we will ever get 100%. Right. Let's go ahead and call it here. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to share the results of this poll so that you know who is in the webinar with you. So let's go ahead and share the results. So most of you are currently utilizing the FMEA 4th edition. or you are in the process of transitioning, you see we kind of got an equal split. This is important because when we talk about these tools, if a fair amount of you are using 4th edition or what we'll call the older version of FMEA, these tips apply to the old ones as well as the new. So everything we're going to cover applies to both. So don't automatically discount it just because you may be early in your journey. The other one, notice here in the results that most of you have at least 1 to 4 individuals in your organization dedicated to the facilitation or the moderation of this methodology. This is an important designation because, and I'll tell you straight up, what you're going to hear from me over the next hour, your technical ability to do an FMEA is important at about 50%. The other 50% will be in your ability to work in soft skills and small team management to achieve a high level of event. So not only is the technical competency important in FMEA, but you're also going to need a certain amount of soft side skills. And many of these tips and tricks will rely on your ability to leverage your small team. So the good news is, if you have those facilitators, those moderators, or if you don't, if you have nobody, you may be the Lone Ranger out there in your organization. And if you are one of those facilitators or one of those moderators, you'll walk away with a couple new tools in your tool belt. And lastly, we have a fairly diverse group here. We've got a large percentage of people, 42%, having 8+ years. So the good news is we can skip right past the tech and get into the tools. That tells me I don't have to cover the tech into this webinar. All right. Brian, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Yes,
All right. Brian, would you like to take him through the FMEA life cycle, my friend?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So the FMEA life cycle is something that some organizations struggle with, but some do a great job with. I know when I was first taught FMEA, it was one of those, complete this form, put it in your PPAP binder, hand it to your customer, they sign off on it. And the next time you have to look at that is the next time we have to PPAP, and just to make sure it's up to date. Well, that was a very, very flawed way of looking at the FMEA, because there's a lot of valuable information that goes into that. And a lot of organizations still do that. When I was in supplier quality, I would see a lot of my suppliers look at it and say, I did an FMEA. You'd look at the data on it, it was 5, 6, 7 years old. So by that point, they really didn't do an FMEA because a lot of life had changed at that point. But the mindset was, it's an event, you do it one time, you make an analysis, it's a check the box in the design process, whether it be for product or process design. And then the next time you look at it is when you're doing something new. So there was no leveraging of improvement. There was no nothing. It was a once in a lifetime event, and then you put it aside and you lived life as it was explaining. So we know that that's wrong. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about the life cycle. And that is, it's a continuous process. For the sake of this webinar, we broke it into 4 ideas you can see there of initiation, development, maturity, and leverage. And you can see where we baseline that below the APQP phases that are out of the APQP handbook of AIG. But each stage there, we do allow you to maximize that impact of the FMEA in the organization. When you're at initiation, what am I trying to do? What am I trying to accomplish? And when you look at the 7-step methodology, you're getting into structure, you're getting into function, not only of design, but process, but you're really setting down, what are you trying to accomplish? The development, again, you're building, you're analyzing as you're going through all your developments, you're using those inputs and outputs of your design process and the FMEA as an input and an output, and they're feeding each other, and you're taking all that knowledge that you've gained throughout the years. Then finally, with maturity, you have an established process, an established design, and now you start to leverage that. And as we leverage that, we're looking at some very specific things. One is the ongoing life cycle of the product, that you're going to continue to share that knowledge no matter what. But the other is future development. All of that content that you've developed in that FMEA will continue to feed not only your current processes and designs, but future processes and designs. It's a starting point. It's a launch pad for those future endeavors that your organization goes into. And the key things you're passing along are your institutional knowledge, but also your lessons learned. Again, when you look at the life cycle of FMEA, a couple of things that are not appearing there. One would be if there's ever a corrective action, if there's ever a design change, any sort of improvement, or we'll just say disruptive event in your organization. When you go back and look at that FMEA and you update it, you've updated that knowledge base that now level sets everything in your organization. Again, best practice, the read across would be part of that leverage opportunity. And then as your future initiations come up, you're taking that current process, that current product, and building off of that so that knowledge is automatically built into whatever you're doing. So with that, we're going to get into some detail in the next slide with Jeremy about initiation.
All right, folks, and I'm back. So we're going to talk about initiation. Now, Brian walked you through the 4 stages. When we talk about initiation, you kind of see where initiation begins and where it ends. You can think of it kind of like a phase gate. And so this is stuff that you're going to do kind of before the kickoff, so to speak. Now, in the AIAG VDA FMEA handbook, and again, that is a lot of letters, they mentioned the 5 T's. So for those of us that were Six Sigma practitioners, this is not necessarily new. These are things that you would routinely have in a normal Six Sigma style project charter. And in the book, they list out the 5 T's as being intent, timing, team, task, and tools. So the way this works is these are not implied to be hierarchical. There is no one that is given more precedent over another one. And one of the things that a lot of people do is by human nature, they get them jumbled up. So what I propose as one of the most important things in the introduction of the FMEA is the prioritization of the 5 T's into a hierarchy. Now let's take a look here. I'm going to do some live draw on the screen. The hierarchy that we are proposing, and again, not required. This is a tool. This is a tip. Intent is everything, okay? Intent is the top dog. It is the alpha. It is the genesis point, which then leads to team. Now, here's why we're thinking this. Think about NASA, right? When NASA decides to go on a mission, do they look at the astronauts that they have and then decide which mission they're going to go on? Absolutely not. That is completely the tail wagging the dog. Intent is everything. Intent is objective. Intent is mission. It's from the intent that you choose the right skill set in order to carry out the objective. And the reason the team comes before tools is because the team's limitations will dictate the type of tools that they are able to use. So if you don't have a large analytical group, but a lot of your tools are very analytical in nature, you will never have success in terms of putting those tools in that team's hand. From there, we go into timing. How are we going to utilize the tools in terms of the timing? And the last and most, say, operational of these is definitely task, right? When we think about task, this is just taking the work that has to be done and divvying it up, let's say, in order to meet some sort of a schedule. Thus why timing comes on top of task. The reason that most groups get this backwards is because intent is synonymous with objective and it is vague. Now, hear me very closely. Now, this is that second bullet down there. Intent forms the basis of everything. And when we come up with objective, an objective is measurable. So you've heard the saying, if I have 8 hours to chop down a tree, I will spend 6 sharpening my axe. The reason why people just jump right to task is because it is easy to open up a calendar. It is easy to start filling out tasks. But unless you understand your true north, unless you understand the objective, you will never arrive where you plan on. And the reason why most people shy away from intent is because they're not sure why they're engaging in the behavior. When you initiate an FMEA, and I will talk PFMEA as an example, and then I'll do D. You should have an objective statement that clearly defines the boundaries, the scopes, and the measures of success. So if you are creating an FMEA for an entire line based on existing line A, the PPM target of 15, a scrap target of 2%, and a cycle time of 3 seconds, those are objective. Those are measurable. And those will define every decision that you make down the road. And the reason why people shy away from this is because in step 7, when you have to reconcile against step 1, and it turns out your PPM is 55, your scrap rate is 8%, and it takes you 6 seconds to make a part, you're then forced to realize that your PFMEA was ineffective. And instead of feeling bad about it being ineffective, we choose not to measure it at all. The same thing is true with design. If I have a design and I set a certain amount of warranty return for design related issues, it goes out into the field and I have 3 times the amount of design related warranty, my DFMEA was ineffective. So the first big tip that I'm going to give you to weaponize this initiation phase, set an intent statement, think of it like objective, make sure that the objective is measurable, and then choose your team, tools, timing, and tasks accordingly. Don't get it twisted. Don't go for the easy thing of task because it's mechanical. That is a surefire way to end up with a lot of activity and 0 results. Brian, do you have anything to add on this one tool for intent?
I think you've covered that one real well, Jeremy.
All right, let's go ahead and take a look now. Once we get through the initiation portion, the next section we're going to do is we're going to take a look at development. Now you see this is the biggest line. Now it is during development for both DFMEA and PFMEA that you will largely flesh out the functional analysis. Now this is for design FMEA as well as P. It's all the same. And I'm going to talk to mostly my automotive folks, but as Bill mentioned, I've authored on many different systems, and this is a universal concept. In the IATF, as well as ISO, as well as aerospace, there are 3 magic words that define how effective your function is going to be. Now, you might not think of these, and we're here to make an association. We're here to make a connection. The graphic on your screen is going to show responsibility, authority, and role. Now, this is in the IATF standard for organizational. It's around 5.3 in the IATF and ISO. But I want you to apply something here from the organizational control side into FMEA. Now, the graphic that I have here shows responsibility being balanced with the corresponding authority on the fulcrum that an individual plays in the organization. Folks, when I do organizational turnaround, one of the most critical cancers in an organization is you give somebody an exorbitant amount of responsibility, but no authority to carry it out. You know what a responsibility without authority is? It's called blame. And that's going to lead to missed deadlines and ineffective teams. So if we take this into the realm of FMEA, in design, you can never task a structural component with a responsibility that it does not have the authority to carry out. Based on its role, it's supposed to carry out in the design. As an example, I cannot task the caliper assembly of a car with stopping the vehicle. It can't do it. It doesn't have the authority to stop the vehicle. All it can do is convert pressure into clamping force. That's it. The same thing is true in PFMEA. If my operator is operating a machine, that operator cannot say press the bearing into the tube. All the operator can do is actuate the machine. That's it. So the 2 techniques that I want to give you here. When I do consultation during the development of FMEA, both D and P, I've developed 2 rules. Every function must be unique. Only in the very rare circumstances will you ever have a situation in which you repeat a function at various levels. And you must balance the responsibility you give to that station, that work element, that structural component, or that subsystem, depending on if you're P or D, with the authority it has to carry it out. Because if you give it a responsibility that it doesn't have the authority to carry out, you will get a very, very poor result in your work. So these are two rules that we use on the daily when we consult. This is how you get a good functional analysis for both D and P. Now, let's take these two rules and now let's apply them over to examples from the handbook. I'm going to do the design one, and then Brian's going to take you through the process one. All right. So this is a very common structural diagram, and this is for the design. Now, let's see if we duplicated functions. Brush card base body transports force. Carbon brush body transports electrical current. The electromagnetic converter transforms the electrical current field, and the commutation system transports electrical current. Ooh, wait a minute, Jeremy. You said they couldn't be the same. But notice the subtle differences. Transports electrical current between carbon stranded wire, transports electrical current between coil pairs of the electromagnetic converter. These two are in effect different. This is a great example of every function being unique. Not one function is repeated. And notice the responsibility section that is given. We did not task the carbon brush right here with converting electrical energy into mechanical energy, right? Moving the window glass up and down to velocity. Why? It can't do that. All it can do is this. So one of my first tools, let's say during development, every function must be unique. If I see redundant functions, I have questions. And did you task only those structural elements from step 2 of the methodology into the areas in which they have the authority to carry out the responsibility that you gave it? So you see these two rules? These two rules hold up universally. Brian, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Brian, would you like to take them through PFMEA real fast on this example from the AIG FMEA handbook?
Absolutely. So, Jeremy, as you just spoke about with authority and having unique functions, we have the same thing on the process side. If we look through along the right-hand column there, we look at the process function, you're looking at the operator pressing the button. Then you're looking at the operator moving the material from and pushing it into the shaft. Then you go to the press function where the press aligns, and then the machine centers, and then it presses the sintered bearing into the hole. So each step along the way, as you're analyzing it, you're analyzing a unique function of that process. So all of that being part of that sintered bearing press-in process. That level of detail for your function and for your structure is what's going to allow you to really find out those failure modes, those failure effects, and bring things to light. Because if you're not looking at it from this granular perspective, you're going to miss a lot of stuff that can go wrong in your process. And we know that our processes, no matter how well constructed they are, something's always going to go wrong. We're always going to find a creative way to make a mistake, and something's always going to lead into that. So this granularity, while people may say, well, that's a lot of work, but this is the type of work you need to do to be successful down the road. If you're not diving in, you're leaving yourself to where you're going to be writing a lot of corrective actions in the future. And those take a whole lot more time to fix than this does right now. And I'm speaking from personal experience on that with, containments and things like that I had been through, that it would have been a whole lot easier had we done a better job of this up front to eliminate a lot of the issues that I've dealt with in my career.
Okay, awesome job. So folks, what I'd like to do right now is I'd like to just kind of level set here. One of the first things we talked about in this seminar, we talked about the use of a life cycle perspective in optimizing your FMEA activity. Then we talked about initiation and putting together a hierarchical approach to the 5 T's in order to put objective first. Then each function must be unique, followed by each function must be mapped to a responsibility that matches its level of authority. So the next step in our journey here is we're going to talk about maturity. So you've done this functional analysis, you've done your initial PFMEA or DFMEA, and now you're going into launch. Maturity is kind of like its maiden voyage, let's say, out into the world. And the first tool that we really utilize during the maturation stage of the FMEA is the reverse FMEA. Now, here's the thing that's happening. A lot of you may be familiar with reverse FMEA. Many of you, this may be the first time you've ever heard it. The way that I want to approach it, don't over ritualize it, okay? So when we do reverse FMEA, you actually go out to the line, and then what happens is you compare what you see in the reality at the actual point of work, and you work your way backward to validate the assumptions made during that first FMEA. Folks, this is simply a bottom-up event that provides validation and real-world applicability to the assumptions that you made prior to launch. So we've created just a real simple 4-bullet type of checklist here, and then Brian's going to augment what I talk about here with his experience. Some of the things we look at: occurrence values. During your reverse FMEA, validate your reality versus actual performance. Give you an example. If you said on a scale of 1 to 10, it was a 2, you made 100 parts and you got 15 of them rating for rework, I guarantee you your assumption made earlier does not match your reality. Poke yolks, the preventions that you put in, are they still functioning as intended? And I guarantee you that a lot of people on this call go out to the lines and they realize that the poke yolks they put in place are no longer functioning. Are there new failure chain additions? And lastly, is the risk profile you identified early still applicable? Brian, do you have anything you would like to add on reverse FMEA from your experience?
Yeah, a couple things. Yeah, a couple things, Jeremy. First off, reverse FMEA is something that if you've ever had a customer come into your plant, they do this. So the very first thing when they walk out to the line, and I had, customer quality reps that would come into my plant, well, let's see your FMEA. What are you doing? And they walk that through and they make sure what you say you have doing in your FMEA matches up with what you're actually doing. Now, I understand for design, it's going to be a little different, but for process, it's really straightforward to take that and walk that through. Now, methodology in my mind's eye that kind of is a really good parallel to this is if you've ever done a corrective action and you've done that 5 why process, when you flip that and turn it into a because process and you walk back to validate your hypothesis for your root cause, it's the same thing here. You're going back, you're taking your FMEA and basically going and reversing what you're doing, making sure that you have everything there. You're going to find some things you probably missed. You're also going to find some things you probably just missed on as far as how you evaluated it. And as Jeremy even said too, is your error proofing functioning as it is intended? Is it even still there? I personal experience, again, if you're not doing this, you're not validating, you're not engaged with your process, you're going to go out there someday and it's not where it's supposed to be because somebody, for some reason, it doesn't work. So again, that's an effectiveness issue that you would catch in this process by walking it back. So really the key takeaways are your customers are doing it to you when they show up, but this is a good way to make sure everything that needs to be in that FMEA is there, but also everything that's in that FMEA that's intended to improve your process function is there and operating as it's intended to operate.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. All right, so let's take a look at the second thing. So we're fully in the maturation mode here of the FMEA. Now, the other thing that we talk about is the integration into the business system, okay? So when we think about the 2 models for FMEA, and I've been around the block a long time, so I have heard this more often than not, I guarantee you that at least 25% of the people on this call have annual FMEA reviews. Okay, That is the completely wrong way to do it. And the reason why I say the completely wrong way, when we look at the traditional way that people have done it, they put the FMEA out here, while their business system, on the other hand, remains inside the boundaries of this box. And what happens is, on one magical day, every 365, they then say, what did we learn about the other 364 days out of the year that we should update into the FMEA? Now, I don't know about you, but the average person can barely remember a top 10 list. It's been scientifically proven that the ability of the human being to remember things gets fuzzy after the first 4. So if we're counting on our memories to be the way that after 364 days, we remember what we did, it's solely ineffective. Now, on the other hand, the model that you want to adopt, the FMEA is the single biggest repository of organizational knowledge for your organization. And here in a second, Brian's going to give us an example of how even things you may not think about impact your FMEA. And the reason why I have double-ended arrows to this, there is no decision that you make during the normal course of business in a day which will not have an impact on the FMEA, and the FMEA will not have input into that decision. So think of it like an oracle. Think of it going to the FMEA and consulting the impact of what you're about to do. And then the FMEA is going to tell you the risks that are involved in the decision you're about to make. And for those that are on this call, and I can already squash it right now, the bad news is most people on this call will be the only ones to fly this standard going back to that organization. The people in your organization outside of this call wouldn't have gotten the message. So the good news is, by getting this message, you have the burden now of carrying that ball. Now, that's good news and bad news. But notice that we think about things like even processes such as hiring. The qualifications around hiring have an impact into the FMEA. So the FMEA, when you go to hire somebody new, you should be setting that criteria based on, say, the criticality of the function they're about to perform. Same thing with purchasing. When you bring on a new vendor, you need to go to the DFMEA and the PFMEA and determine that if it's a critical function in your part, because that's going to set the control methodology. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian for a second, and Brian's going to walk you through a real life example in terms of how a process you may not consider actually had an impact. Brian?
Sure, Jeremy. I'm going to throw you one curve. I have one other thing that you mentioned that I want to expound upon, and then I'll get into that example. And that is going from ineffective to effective. When I started in an organization as an engineer, we did isolated FMEAs. Now, everything we did on our individual lines were shared processes as far as rotary welding, and we did all the same stuff, but we had unique FMEAs for each line. The manager that I worked for, he and I worked to change the culture on that, and we developed one family FMEA for what we were doing. And so what we did is we took the FMEA from outside the box to inside the box. Now, how we kind of forced that was, again, he had the leverage and the authority and the responsibility of getting us in the room. But once we got that going and teams saw the benefit, the FMEA review wasn't an annual event. We met at a minimum every other week just to go over things that were going on. And it got to the point where organically people would just come to my desk and say, hey, I put a couple sensors in. I want to make sure we get that logged on the FMEA. And then when we finally sit down, it was already teed up for discussion that it was being added or it had been added. And now people had questions to ask. And so it really flipped it from, here's this isolated PPAP activity to this is something we actually lived by as a group. And it made all the difference. I mean, I was the coordinator for that. And at first I thought it was a punishment, but I learned more from my teammates by facilitating this than I would have just by doing FMEAs we did. So that effectiveness really bubbles up real quickly when you make that part of your everyday lifestyle. Now, the example I want to give goes back to my college days. And I was in a paint department in an automotive facility, and we were shut down for a bit. So they sent the engineers over to another plant in the area. And they started getting these mysterious paint Mars on a Friday afternoon. And for those of you that don't know, real high level, a Mars basically, it's a discoloration of the paint. If you're a painter, I know that's overly simplified, but when you see that discoloration in the paint, that effectively is what a Mar is. And they can come from a myriad of different reasons. But they were able to trace back the frequency of this Mar to Friday afternoon, starting around 12:15, this Mar would start appearing. And for the life of them, they spent about 6-7 weeks trying to figure out what was causing it. And they're wiping down vehicles differently, and they're checking to see for leaks or anything else. Well, come to find out that Friday was fried chicken day in the cafeteria. So our employees would go down. And I was at school at the time when I came back. They said it was incredible fried chicken, by the way. So it was definitely worth going to eat it. But they would come back, and our guys would come back from the line, our team would come back, and we'd start having these Mars. And they were able to trace it back to the chicken grease, because even by putting their gloves on, they were getting chicken grease on the outside of their gloves, and that was transferring over to the vehicle. The simple fix when they found that out was they didn't ban the chicken from people, but they had some extra wash stations and made sure people scrubbed, and they had a pretty aggressive soap to get that off of them so that it didn't transfer over, and the problem did go away. But it's even something as simple as, what are you serving for lunch? What are you doing here? What are you doing there? These things can come in and create problems in your process. So when you have this coordination, if it wasn't for somebody thinking, hey, well, we had chicken and now all of a sudden we have these Mars, we would have never come up with that, because it would have been hey, it's crazy, we don't know what's happening, and a potential mechanical thing. And that coordination, that keeping it inside all of your processes, really goes a long way to fix some of these problems. And once it went away, it was solved. It became a joke for a little bit for us, but we started watching for other factors like that, other things that were happening in the plant that could be brought into a clean room environment like that could create a quality issue.
All right. Excellent. So there's a couple things on maturity, right? Just touching back on there. Definitely the reverse FMEA is your validation of your initial assumptions. Remember the goal of FMEA being a realistic risk profile. If you make certain assumptions and you never validate those assumptions, it's kind of a form of delusion. So that being said, the integration into the business system and the FMEA being consulted and revised as the result of activity is one of the most important things that you can do, also to gain relative immediate acceptance of the FMEA. So if there is a benefit, people have short memories. If you wait for an entire year for the benefit to come up, never going to happen. If it benefits them in the short term due to effective feedback loops, you will get a higher acceptance. Now, let's go ahead and let's do the second poll. I realize we're about 2/3 of the way through this, so some people might be sleeping. All right, let's go ahead and grab poll 2 here. Let's go ahead and launch it. Now, we brought up reverse FMEAs. Here's the question. In your organization, are you performing reverse FMEAs? The second question is, when we talk about the Foundation and Family FMEAs, I'm interested because that's something we're going to talk about next, where you are in that development. That'll tell me how deeply I need to go. And lastly, third, which software do you currently use? Because I'm going to have the software discussion when it comes to Foundation and Family. You guys, a second here. Same 80% rule applies, folks. Again, one of the reasons why you guys are filling this out is because I want you to feel that you're not alone. Many times in automotive manufacturing or manufacturing in general, we think that sometimes our challenges are unique only to our facilities. But what you're going to find through this is that largely a fair amount of companies share your exact struggle. So the good news is your struggle is unique, but it may not be that different than the person next to you. All right, getting to get to that 80% here. We'll go ahead and stop in a second. All right, good deal. We'll end this out and let's share the results. So the good news is a couple of you are utilizing reverse FMEA, roughly a third. It's roughly a 2/3 to 1/3 though that Reverse FMEA is not used. Now, this is where I want to connect with. Don't think that there has to be a formal reverse FMEA process in your organization. The question I would ask, what method are you using to validate your assumptions that you make during the development stage of your FMEA? If you're using some process to validate it, you are doing some form of reverse FMEA. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to the family FMEA question, the good news is we've got about a 50-50 split, let's say, between currently developed and starting development. So I do have a couple folks who are unfamiliar with the concept, so we are going to cover it just a little bit deeper than I normally would. That's good feedback for what I'm about to go through. And the good news is most of you are still utilizing the old Excel spreadsheet method. So that helps me kind of frame what's about to come out of my mouth with the next step. All right, let's go ahead and stop sharing and get after it. All right, so now we're talking about leverage. So you've done the initiation, you've done the development, you're getting feedback, you're getting information during the maturation portion. The next stage, there comes a time in the FMEA's existence where its sole purpose is to communicate the lessons learned into the next generation of either product or process. This is the leverage stage. And to kind of blow this up a little bit, Foundation and Family FMEAs are that cornerstone. Now, just in case you wanted to loop it back to the 7 steps, notice here in step 1 of the 7 steps, identification of the baseline FMEA with lessons learned. Now, this is an important designation, folks. Why did they frame it this way? Why did they phrase it this way? Because revision for the human creature is easier than creation. One of the most daunting and intimidating things is the creation of something from nothing. And so if you can give your organization something to revise as a baseline, as a starting point, you get a higher quality of event. And the reason you get a higher quality of event, you are able to isolate the deltas. Now, hear me very closely when I say that. If you are able to take a baseline FMEA, whether it is foundation or family, and identify what is different, you get to a higher quality of event in your FMEA. Plus, the efficiency raises substantially. I'll tell you in experience, roughly, if you use a foundation or a family, FMEAs will take you around 20 to 30% of the normal time. So that's the efficiency expectation that you might want to set. Now, the way this works here, this graphic, we put the foundation as the most generic. So as an example, if we have a PFMEA that's cutting, turns out failure modes, cut too long, cut too short. Simple. If you clamp it down when you cut, what's the failure cause? Clamp becomes loose. Simple. And this is universal every time you do that cutting. Now at the family side, maybe you cut metal and maybe you cut plastic. And if the heat gets too crazy when you cut metal, there's no impact. But if the heat gets too crazy when you cut plastic, that plastic can shrink, leading to a new failure cause for plastic cut parts. And then, of course, there are always those pesky CSRs and the unique things for customer specifics. So the way that you want to approach it, think of it like a library. And when you get that feedback from the maturation step, you ask, does it impact the foundational? Does it impact my family? Or is this so unique to this one part number that that's the only thing that it impacts? The same is true for D. With DFMEA, a lot of times your design, such as a caliper, will fulfill certain functions, right? It's going to move pressure into clamp force, and it does that in all the disc brake style designs, but then you may have some that are hydraulic and some that are pneumatic. So foundation, family, this is one of those high leverage things in terms of the leverage stage of the FMEA's life cycle. Brian, do you have anything to add to this?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. So we look at this, and one of the things that we stress with FMEA in practical application is read across. One way to help affect the read across is to use a family and foundational FMEA, because as you update these documents and these family and foundational documents, you're getting that information out to everybody that's going to access it. So whenever you pull from that, you're going to have the latest and greatest information in there. So that knowledge sharing of your designs and your processes is being facilitated through the process of using family and foundational FMEA. Now, one way in my eye, I structure this is that my foundation, that's the 101 stuff I do. You know, if you're receiving, you're shipping, your material handling, things that are consistent no matter what you're doing, you can throw those in a foundational level. And as you get more specific, you get into a family level, and then obviously the part specific documents are where you hit the highest specificity. But that foundation, that is your knowledge base, that is your starting point, it's your launch pad to create the rest of these documents. Now, what's handy is that if you are using a software, which we can talk about here in a couple minutes, is that you can utilize the database features of your software to build this. So as you are making updates, you can get those updates broadcast out to the part specific documents that are based on these foundational and family levels, and get that content out where it needs to be significantly quicker than trying to go through and update 150 different Excel files. So it is, you know, the benefits of this are huge, not only with sharing the base knowledge, but for updates and other things like that, and keeping your content current. It also keeps you focused on what your meeting is about. Because if you are looking to update your FMEA and you look at those family foundational levels, that's where you're going to have your greatest impact for affecting all your processes and all your designs, is looking at that base that everything is off of. So again, when we focus on foundation, we focus on family, that's going to affect the most that we have going on in our facility, those FMEAs, and it's going to get that knowledge out there faster.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. Brian, would you like to walk him through and take him home on the end of this before we open up the Q&A?
Absolutely. So the AIG and VDA FMEA handbook, and I think I noticed a writer or two that were on the meeting, and I will tell you, I sat there for 2 years with them. Those are the truly significant FMEA experts. I learned more about FMEA in 2 years than I did the previous 25 in the industry, because I had some people that were just brilliant on this team that I was, you know, given the opportunity to sit in on and watch the project get finished. So that is out there. It is available. I saw some questions come up about transitioning and customer specifics, things like that. The thing we can tell you is when we know at AIG, we share that, or we at least give the OEMs an opportunity to share that at our different events. Ford did make an announcement, but again, please check their customer specific requirements. And if you are a supplier of those organizations, they will be notifying you with those changes. But again, the IATF website with the customer specific requirement documents, it's the fastest way they're going to do that, but maintain that relationship with that supplier quality engineer that you deal with to make sure that you know where that's at. But the document is out there. It's been out there 2.5 years. I know transition's hard. That's the complaint we've heard, is that it's different. It's and all the other things, but you know, we did this in mind of moving the industry forward. And also when we did some of the, you know, the testing before it came out with people that had never done FMEA before, they were impressed with the logic of it. So I really do like the methodology. I think the 7-step approach formalizes a lot of things we were doing in 4th edition, but takes it even beyond. And quite frankly, if you're supplying to both, you know, the European and the North American, and you know, and I don't want to slight, because you know, Honda North America was on the team and Daimler Truck and some of the folks, but by commonizing this, it goes a long way to make sure that now this FMEA methodology is consistent across the board. So that is available at the AIG website. We also have a training bundle with an e-learning and an e-document with it. And just a little sneak peek, there's going to be some changes, some e-documents and accessibility coming up as well. So please keep following AIG for that information as that comes up. You can hit the next slide, please. Software. People always say, can you recommend a software? We can't recommend a software provider, but I can recommend my software. And our CTS software was designed as the replacement for the Core Tools Forms disk. And we are, in fact, just testing, and we have the release coming out this weekend of family and foundational FMEA capability with it. The initial stuff I've done with it and through the testing that I've done, I'm really excited about this, because I remember having to update multiple Excel files for the same change, and it was a pain in the neck. It was time consuming. And when I'd go home at the end of the day, I thought I just wasted about 6 hours of my life playing in Excel all day and didn't get to do any brain work. Well, this is going to allow you to make those updates, and it goes both ways. If you update family content from the from your part specific, and it will share that information and allow you to accept it in the family or foundational, or vice versa. So if you want to get that information out there quickly, this is a great way to do it. We are seeing and hearing more and more interest in software, and for doing that, and again, like I say, keep in tune with your customers to see what their requirements are coming up. But this is available. In January, we also have a 2-for-2 promotion where if you're an AIG member, you get 2 CTS licenses for 2 years for free. Again, it's members only on that one, but at $360 a license, it's a pretty affordable software as well. So something we're very proud of. We think that there's a lot of good tools in that can be used. We're trying to make sure that we are directionally correct with that for the industry. And then finally, our training and resources. You see the 4 FMEA courses we've been offering for a couple of years, and Jeremy does the vast majority of the teaching, a lot of these, as well as some of the other folks at Plexus, but Jeremy's taught the majority of these courses that we've had on site. So these are some good courses, but a couple of things we have coming up is there's going to be an upcoming Reverse FMEA course that's going to be added to our portfolio. I think it's a 2.5-hour boot camp style scenario. Again, if you know how to do FMEA, this is just to walk through the methodology for Reverse FMEA so that you have a good understanding and some tips and tools on how to go out and properly do a Reverse FMEA. Also being added to our portfolio is what was new to the AIG and VDA FMEA handbook was the concept of FMEA for monitoring and system response, or the FMEA MSR, which is an add-on to the design FMEA. We do have some FMEA MSR training coming as well in 2022, and it will be an add-on to the DFMEA course, a 3rd day to the 2-day class. But we're going to have some standalone. So if you've completed the DFMEA course and you want to get that MSR portion, you'll be able to come in and take that as well. So I do ask that you do follow AIG, whether it be on LinkedIn or sign up for the newsletters or whatever venue that we do broadcast our stuff. But please, be available to get this information and take advantage of these courses as they come up. And with that, we are at our post-event survey, and then I think we have some questions coming up as well.
All right, Bill, are you with us?
Yes, I am. I'm back.
All right.
So,
Get it cracking.
I want to thank everybody for your questions. I can pretty much tell you that we will not get through 41 questions before we're done. So those questions will be pulled, and we will respond to everybody accordingly. So don't think we're ignoring you. Start out with a simple one. Brian referenced the Ford announcement. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
That's Ford's announcement to make. We expect to hear something January. They did announce software, some things like that, but they're drafting the final specifics of it. And I know that our steering committee member that's involved in writing that, she's still working on it. And I promise not to steal any thunder, but if you are a Ford supplier, keep your eyes open for that, because that will be released at some point after the first of the year. I don't exactly know when, but as soon as we know something, they'll announce it.
Oh, okay. If in the FEMA example of unique functions, how close to the machinery FEMA does one go with a P FEMA? I struggle with defining the boundary of process FEMA and machine FEMA, especially when breaking down the steps granularly.
All right, so here I'll give you my opinion, and Brian give you his. Here's the way it works. In the PFMEA, you set boundaries to assume that all incoming inputs are good. The one we're most traditionally comfortable with is, say, incoming material, right? It clearly says in the handbook that we should make the assumption that all incoming material is good, with the exception of certain historical issues, right? Exceptions can be made. I'm going to take what we know about the product, and I'm going to say inputs. The MFMEA could be thought of as the design FMEA for machine builders. So we assume that the machine as delivered to the line has been designed correctly to meet intent. The PFMEA will handle any errors that occur during the operation. So use the MFMEA prior to it entering the P, and then your PFMEA handles machine errors that occur during the routine operation. Brian, your opinion?
I agree with you. And the other thing I want to throw in is just, you're assuming good product coming in, you're assuming the machine works, but you're also assuming that the product design is effective. So that let that tooling FMEA be very specific for the tooling, the machine build, things like that. Now, yeah, there can be some gray area on that or some overlap. And I guess for your own comfort, if you want to err on the side of cautiousness, that's fine. But if you're doing a robust machinery FMEA, those lines of demarcation will start to bubble up pretty clearly once you get a couple of those under your belt.
Yep. Good call.
Can you give me an example of a measurable intent definition?
Measurable intent definition. Oh, that's a simple one. Let's say that we're making a cutting operation. The cutting operation has to be a process that operates under, say, 15 ppm with scrap rate less than 2% and a cycle time of less than 20 seconds. That's really it. I mean, objective, those are measurable. And then you'd say, hey, we're going to base it on this line using historical baselines from this time frame to kind of scope in the PFMEA, but the objective is synonymous with intent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the new FEMA version uses AP rather than RPN. What is the main advantage, and are you strongly recommending that we move away from 4th edition?
All right, so I can tell you, as somebody that sat in meetings where people were arguing whether something should be a 4 or a 5 because a mythical RPN threshold is out there where the arithmetic makes all the difference, action priority takes that all away. If you look at the AP table and you get to that point where you're arguing whether it should be a 4 or a 5 or a 6 or a 7, and you're reading it and you can argue both ways, when you look at that action priority, you can look and say, look, whether it's a 6 or 7, it's going to be a medium anyway. So you start taking some of this waste out. The other is, and this is how I was initially taught, was we put the bogey out there, everything under you don't have to ever look at again, and everything over you have to do a recommended action on. And by the way, if I had an RPN over, and our number, first place I learned this was 50. If I had an RPN over 50, I was getting called into the front office and shamed because my process wasn't quote unquote good enough, even though it was realistic. Action priority, one of the benefits of that is it's taking away that temptation of throwing a threshold out there. The other thing with the methodology is that the concept of recommended action is gone. It's now optimization. So it's part of the integrated process to where you're going through and performing optimization for everything. So when we talk about being truthful with ourselves, the opportunity to lie to ourselves is really going away with action priority, because it is, it is what it is. I mean, those mediums are going to be there. You stop wasting time over some, frivolous arguments, but it's also, you have to optimize anyway. So it's a natural flow through to, are you looking at everything? Are you evaluating everything? Can it be affected? Can it not be affected? And the other thing it does is it puts the emphasis on severity. Those 9s and 10s that hit safety items are going to wind up being high action priority unless you're incredible at preventing it and incredible at detecting it. So when we were doing straight RPN, it was a 3-number arithmetic. Now with action priority, we're weighting severity, then we're weighting occurrence, then we're finally weighting detection. And that's going to help funnel things into the proper areas to where we should be focusing versus just allowing the arithmetic to speak.
Okay, and is CTS software available in Spanish?
See, it is. One of the neat things about it is we translate our content, not yours. AIG is a not-for-profit, so we don't have that liability insurance that if we screw up the translation, cause your control plan or FMEA to go bad, we don't have the money to cover it. And I kind of like my job, so I don't want to get into that part of it. But you own all your intellectual property in there. We're not affecting it. We're not touching it. But we will change the presentation language of our content. It's a simple drop down. If you're a North American company, if you're based out of somewhere in the US or Canada, you come to AIG, we set you up and you're under that account. If you have offices or organizations that speak Latin Spanish or Mexican Spanish, they can drop it into Spanish for them. Also simplified Chinese. Now, if you're based in Mexico, as some of you may be, or you're based in China, our regional offices that we work with Plexus for sales, you can go straight to them. They handle the sale for you in Mexico or China, depending on where you're at. And then they also offer in-language support with those field technical experts that we have in place down there. So if you come to me, it's going to be in English. If you go to Mexico, you go, but your subscription has to be through Mexico or China to take advantage of it. If it's through me, I'm sorry, I speak English and you heard the extent of my Spanish already, and that's about it. So.
Okay, and I've dropped my email into the chat a couple times here. So if you would like to talk to somebody in Mexico regarding CTS, let me know, and I'd be happy to forward you on accordingly. And to answer the second half of the question, is the training translated in Spanish? Yes. The training's translated in Spanish. It's translated into Chinese. It's actually French, and I mean, you name it, we're global, so it's pretty simple to get the translations done.
To differentiate that, though, the CTS training, if you come to me, is going to be in English, and we don't technically offer training. We do product overviews and demos for you. That would be in English, but the regional offices in Mexico and China would do it in language. Plexus training on the other things, the IETF, the core tools, the things like that, is multi-language. I just, in case that was leaning into CTS, I just want to make that clear that we're not offering CTS training in French.
And thank you, Brian. Okay, is it right to include non-transforming operations to the FEMA? In my organization, due to the QMS, we need to cover this operation, warehousing, incoming expressions, etc.
I'm going to answer that with the engineering answer I learned in college, and that is, it depends. If you have a material handling issue, historic one, and you put something in as a safe rack or something like that to help transport materials, or an example I had with leak testing and cooling at one point in my career, I had to put a cooling rack in on my my conveyor line. If you have things like that come in there, absolutely put those in, because those are part of your process and part of delivering that quality initiative at the end. If you're just hanging on a slide rail and it's moving on and there's never a history of anything, you don't always have to put that in there, in my experience, but really look at the operation of what you're doing and what the history of it is. And that's going to help drive you as to how far into that you need to drive.
So, okay, in my organization, we do not have defined critical and significant characteristics. Is there some literature available to use as a guide?
I'll take a stab at this one, Brian, and then I'll let you give your opinion on it. The short answer is no. There is no magic lexicon of this is the appendix of what is considered a special characteristic, a critical characteristic, a safety characteristic. Every customer is different. Every symbology is different. And depending on your company, your industry, and your commodity, how you classify those and represent those may be different. So my short answer is there's no universal. Brian?
Absolutely. There's not, from the AIG perspective, if we could ever deliver that, we'd probably be heroes in the industry because it would simplify a lot. But a lot of organizations, view that as a competitive advantage for them. Plus, it's their own language, how they speak it. So we're going back, in some cases, decades of how something was considered. And I know that gets confusing where significant characteristic is defined one way with one company and another with another. And, there it's a critical instead of significant. But, again, the definitive sources go to your customer, and they're going to tell you how to speak that language on that, and just do your best. And again, we bring this up every now and then. If we could get a consistent language throughout the industry, I think people would really, really come to love AIG even more. But it's something yet that we haven't been able to crack the shell on that issue yet. So we'll see. I never say never on that, though. You never know what's going to come out.
Okay, since the FEMA is divided into DFEMA and PFEMA, should it be developed by two people? Now, I mean, the FEMA by a person with process expertise and background, DFEMA by a person with design expertise and background, or is it better that the FEMA is developed by a single person?
Cross-functional teams. If they're being implemented by one person, you're doing it wrong. And that's a mistake a lot of people make. I mean, again, when I learned, it was go in your cubicle, fill out this document, come on out. And realistically, they had developed one, and we were all cribbing off of that and copying it and updating. If they're right in the methodology, use that cross-functional team to develop it, because as we talked about integration, you're not going to know everything unless you bring other people in to be able to integrate that into your business model. Also, it puts their ownership into it, and it makes it that much easier to integrate that in with everything else you're doing. So if you're doing it by yourself, no, bring more people in. And don't overlook maintenance, don't overlook production, don't overlook material, don't overlook scheduling. There's a lot of people that maybe aren't going to have tremendous impact or conversation 99% of the time, but it's just that 1% of the time when they speak up and say, well, wait, did you think about this? that all of a sudden you're going to have that breakthrough and actually not improve the document. That's going to be a benefit of it, but you're going to improve the process, you're going to improve the design and make things more robust for you. And I think Jeremy may have something to add on that too, by the look he had when we first came up with this.
I just mentioned it because it's one of those common things we get, folks. And I will say from a small team development side, Brian is absolutely right. Cross-functional development, but where it gets tricky, a lot of times we get functionally fixed in how we think cross-team development has to occur. So don't be functionally fixed on pulling 10 people into a room for 3 hours. One person opens up an Excel and the other 9 look for sharp objects and they're suffering. Don't do that, right? So there's a lot of ways to get the job done. And Brian's absolutely right. Many times the most technically savvy on the product side may not be the most technologically aware in what's available for prevention and detection on the process side. So having that cross-functional team input is important. However, most organizations fail because they don't implement it correctly. So what's the right answer? It comes down to the effectiveness of the FMEA. Is it working? Is it meeting the risk profile? Is it hitting those objectives? Yep.
Okay, and we're running about 10 minutes over, so you guys tell me when you want to quit. My next question is, it's more of a statement than a question. So from what I'm hearing, the reverse FEMA is real proof of measurement of the quality of how the FEMA was done.
It's validation. It's one step of validation verification. I mean, your customer scorecard is going to be another. There's a lot of feedback, but this is just one way to go out there, and it's a practical application of going out and putting hands on the process to make sure that what you say you're doing, but you can also check and make sure it's working as well.
I would agree with that. Validation and augmentation.
Yeah.
Because you can have a perfectly good FMEA, but augmented as a result of your reverse FMEA. Let's go for another couple minutes, Bill. We can do one more.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, I haven't. No. The major challenge is that FEMAs are provided to the customer, and there's a lot of IP. Also, in different hazardous material industries, the main tool used to evaluate the risk is HAZOP, H-A-Z-O-P. There's already a risk analysis tool, but they mainly focus on safety and security. These are the pros and cons. Do you foresee any update of the tools that will bring both of them to be merged together?
I think when it comes to industries, and especially 3 different areas, let's take a look at quality, being the FMEA, environmental, and safety. I think all 3 of them have separate areas. And the idea of one tool to rule them all largely will not meet the unique needs of any specific one. So I don't see that as happening.
Yeah, there's nothing on our radar right now. It was a labor of love the 4 years we spent on this, and to bring in another group like that would just, I don't know that we'd get a document out before any of us retire.
And I would say also realize that all industries treat risk differently. How automotive treat risk is how different than how medical device does and how different aerospace does. So not only would you have to get environmental safety and quality, let's say, to match, but now each industry has to also accept, and that level is never going to happen.
Okay. So how about we talk about companies that deem FEMAs as proprietary and will not release them? How do we deal with that?
Well, what we dealt with in my situation is I was actually supplying parts to a competitor, and we just came to an agreement that you can come in at PPAP and look at that, or if we're going with the corrective action, you can look at the specific area we're working on and see the updates and the relevant content. You just can't take it. There were no copies taken. Now, granted, a lot of this was done when the phone on your cell phone, or excuse me, the camera on your cell phone was still in early development. But you just again, there's a certain amount of have the NDA out there. It's going to be part of your purchase agreement. It's something you work out up front that we compete with each other, but this is proprietary. But even in the case of you're not competing and it is just proprietary, have that worked out. Your customers, you're probably even, for your own benefit, you're going to want to share this at some time to prove that you did analyze this correctly. but just have that agreement and realize and let them know you're not going to take a copy of this. You can't make copies of it. You can't bring this anywhere. Just you can look at it and you can leave.
So folks, I'm going to wrap it up from here. I've given you my email address. So if there's anything that comes up after the webinar or as you're reviewing it, first off, we will, to answer probably about 10 of the questions in here, we will be sending out on-demand viewing capabilities upon completion of the webinar. Generally, that's within a day of completion. So that takes care of that one. I put my email into the chat box. So if there's any questions that you have that come out after that, let me know. And I will make sure I get with the right person and get your answers to your questions. Any information that you want as far as software or anything of that nature, feel free to reach out to me and I will direct you in the right direction to getting that. So basically, I'll make it easy. You let me know what you're looking for and I'd be happy to assist you in any way possible. Any questions not answered will be responded to. Yeah, give me about a week because I have to track some of these. I have to track Jeremy and Brian down to get the answers. So it takes about a week, but we will answer your questions. So with that, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone.